Elden Ring is filled to the brim with rich and detailed lore created by the minds of Hidetaka Miyazaki, George R.R. Martin, and the team at FromSoftware. However, like most of FromSoftware's recent games, the story and lore are puzzles that players need to piece together in order to fully understand. In this video, I'll do my best to put together the pieces in the way that I understand them. However, there's no specific, correct interpretation here, and I think it's well worth watching other YouTubers to see where you land and find where your personal interpretation lies. So please make sure to support the likes of Smoughtown, Vaatividya, Quelaag, Hawkshaw, the Tarnished Archaeologist, and of course, anyone I've left out. This video incorporates the base game and what we've learned from the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, and there will be massive spoilers for both. I'll try to make it absolutely clear when things are, to my opinion, in-game facts, and when I'm extrapolating, putting my own thoughts in, or reading between the lines. That said, I'm Dave Klein, aka DaveControl, and let's begin.
Long ago, we began as stardust, born of a great rupture far across the skies. We, too, are children of the greater will.
If Count Emir is to be taken at face value and trusted, which I do, the world of Elden Ring began much like our own. There was some sort of Big Bang event, here called the Great Rupture, that started all life. To my interpretation of what Emir is saying, all Stardust would also be children of the Greater Will, so that would mean you could liken the Greater Will to a Judeo-Christian singular god who started all life. That said, the Greater Will is never referred to in-game as a god, but I do wonder if it's on a higher plane than the other stated gods of the game. It also raises a pretty interesting question. Does that mean that all of the outer gods of Elden Ring are children of the Greater Will? After all, the term god is a little loose in Elden Ring, in my opinion. Marika becomes a god, Miquella becomes a god, there are outer gods, some of which seem to be more powerful and Lovecraftian in nature, like the Formless Mother. Then there are nebulous godlike entities like the Greater Will and the Moon, who players can align themselves with. According to Hyetta, who speaks through the three fingers,
all that there is came from the one great. Then came fractures, and births, and souls. But the Greater Will made a mistake. Torment, despair, affliction, every sin, every curse, every one born of the mistake.
This falls in line with what Count Emir told us, but it could also imply that even the outer gods were born of the Greater Will. After all, we often see curses in Elden Ring associated with outer gods. However, it's very possible that outer gods are given their title for a reason, because they aren't of the Greater Will, and that's the understanding I'm personally going forward with. Notably, I know others liken the outer gods to being akin to kami from Shinto religion, which can be a force of nature or gods born from this. So I think we have our beginning. A Big Bang-like event occurred in Elden Ring, which slowly, over time, created all life in the cosmos. While this is attributed to a singular godlike being, the Greater Will, I'll say even this could be lower beings finding an explanation for life and calling it the Greater Will. After all, many of those who study the stars and find deep meaning in them go insane. Master Lusat and Master Azur were two of the founding fathers of glintstone sorcery, and when Azur glimpsed into the primeval current, he saw darkness. He was left both bewitched and fearful of the abyss. When Lusat glimpsed into the primeval current, he beheld the final moments of a great star cluster, and upon seeing it, he too was broken. One possible explanation is that there was no Greater Will, and the universe was more akin to a lifeless abyss. However, this is pure speculation. I think in the case of this universe, the Greater Will is a cosmic being that wants order and is associated with light, and the abyss very well could be the opposite of this, and this darkness is absolutely terrifying to those born into light. Either way, the Greater Will is something that will be exploited for religious and dynastic purposes, as we'll come to learn, and other beings will try to have their own influence on the world. Moving along, at some point in time, the world that inhabits the lands between had life form on it. Personally, I'm going to attribute this to the Crucible, which I think of as Elden Ring's version of primordial soup. At the same time, or perhaps even earlier, outer gods came to be. Outer gods are another nebulous concept, and their true origins are left to interpretation. For me, the word outer gods implies that these gods come from outside of the universe of the lands between, meaning that they're even outside of what the Greater Will created. Another possible interpretation is that they were created by the Greater Will, but they're extremely powerful beings that exist somewhere within the cosmos. The outer gods we know of include the Formless Mother and the Twin Birds god. There are other major deific beings such as the One-Eyed God of the Fire Giants and the Chaos Flame, but overall we know little about when they came into existence. So let's move on to the next era of the world we know about. The earliest age we know of, and beings we know about in the lands between, are the dragons. If I'm correct in likening the Crucible to a sort of primordial goop, and the Greater Will being akin to the Big Bang, this also follows our own history, with dragons being like the lands between's version of dinosaurs. Other gigantic beings did exist in the past as well. We can find colossal humanoid titan-like corpses which may have existed around the same period, before or after. However, the ancient dragons, who we know for certain existed in prehistory, eventually evolved and came into being. And it was around this time that one of the first major events would take place. A meteor would strike the lands, but not just any meteor. The mother of all two fingers and finger creepers was in turn a magnificently gleaming daughter of the Greater Will, and the first shooting star to fall upon the lands between. Meter arrived in the lands between as an envoy of the Greater Will. The mother received signs from the Greater Will from the beyond of the microcosm. Despite being broken and abandoned, she kept waiting for another message to come. It's unclear when exactly Meter became broken. Was it from landing in the lands between? Was it at some future point? Another interesting element is in the Ash of War KOTOR's resentment, which is the Ash of War of the Gazing Finger, a weapon you get from Meter's remembrance. Resentment builds as it is forced to bow, making it explode with anger. Could this mean that Meter did not want to bow to the Greater Will? Either way, a second star would hit the lands between. It is said that long ago, the Greater Will sent a golden star bearing a beast into the lands between, which would later become the Elden Ring. This beast was the Elden Beast, a vassal of the Greater Will and incarnation of the concept of order, and I believe it was this very beast and Meter who would influence the ancient dragons. Interestingly, the Elden Beast looks incredibly similar to a dragon, so while I personally think the dragons evolved out of the Crucible of Life, one could argue that they were also born of this comet. My coworker Timur Hussein pointed out to me that another viable theory is that the Elden Ring and Elden Beast specifically took the form of a dragon to appear more divine, and something that could be a good way to earn their favor and reverence, which is definitely another viable option here. With the Elden Beast, we have the original version of the Elden Ring, which can be found depicted at Farum Azula. Here, a being we don't know ascended to godhood, and with that, the ancient dragon, Placidusax, became that being's Elden Lord, making Placidusax become the first ever Elden Lord, and so the dragons ruled the land. Reading between the lines a bit and speculating, it's my belief that Meter was the fingers who guided the first god, and it's my belief that this first god of the ancient dragons was, in fact, the Elden Beast. This seems fitting to me given the Elden Beast's visual similarities to the dragons. Meanwhile, Placidusax would become the Elden Lord to the Elden Beast. However, I do think this came at a cost, and not every dragon was ready to bend the knee to Placidusax. In particular, Baal the Dread refused to be subjugated. We really don't know the exact motivation of Baal. It could have been to become Elden Lord himself, and given all we know from item descriptions are his refusal to be subjugated, that's where I lean. Although, he might have not wanted to be subjugated to the Greater Will and Elden Beast in general, similar to Ranni. While it's difficult to place exactly when the following event took place, I believe that it was right when Placidusax came to power, and just like how we see conflict amongst humans when one lord tries to take power, Baal and his kin did not agree with the Elden Beast or Placidusax's reign, so he rebelled.
In a time long past, Baal turned upon the Dragon Lord. The foul traitor assailed our master and inflicted a grievous wound, only to make a hasty retreat, becoming a sworn enemy of the brood.
The two drastically wounded one another in the fight, which is why we find Placidusax missing heads and heavily scarred, while Baal is missing a leg, his wings, and his arms. After the battle, Baal retreated to the Jagged Peak. His progeny would be drakes, which are most of the dragons we find in the lands between. As punishment for his transgressions, Placidusax created the rite of dragon communion, and seems to be the very one who started humans entering in dragon communion by hunting dragons and eating their hearts to become drake warriors.
Since that day, Bale and his bloodline, the Drakes, have served as sacrifices for dragon communion. Landbound warrior, my lord Placidusax has shown your kind what must be done. Seek communion. Sate your boundless appetite. Feel the euphoria of a dragon's essence taking root in your meager frame.
This line is the one part that makes me question when exactly this event with Bale took place. After all, humans of this time period might not have been advanced enough to kill a dragon. But then again, maybe this was a gradual process over time. So, what do you think?
Unlike the game's modern dragons, the ancient dragons were incredibly smart and near immortal. The ancient dragons who ruled in the prehistoric era before the Erdtree would protect their lord as a wall of living rock. Another interesting element to these dragons is their nigh immortality. And while beings and gods of the present have their own sort of immortality, I think the dragons are different. We're told of Placidusax, through its remembrance of the Dragon Lord. The Dragon Lord whose seat lies at the heart of the storm beyond time is said to have been Elden Lord in the age before the Erdtree. Once his god was fled, the Lord continued to await its return. So considering that Placidusax resides in a storm beyond time, it makes me wonder if perhaps the storm, and even FromSoftware itself, has something to do with the dragon's immortality. Ancient dragon smithing stones tell us that the ancient Dragon Lord's seat is said to lie beyond time. The stone lightly twists time, allowing the creation of a weapon capable of slaying a god. So even their stones used in smithing allows for the twisting of time, which I think plays into my theory that perhaps their immortality comes from a combination of their immense strength and ability to not follow the strict rules of time. It is worth noting that their description of being immortal could also be referring to the strength of their stone skin, akin to the dragons in Dark Souls who were also thought of as immortal, but lightning was able to defeat. I read into it as being a bit of column A and a bit of column B. They were extremely long-lived, likely thanks to being able to live outside of time, giving the outward appearance of immortality. They were also powerful and had strong stone skin, making them feel immortal, as in difficult to kill or destroy. Dragons didn't just rule the lands of Far Missoula, but far and wide. It's my belief that, from what we learned in the DLC, prior to America cutting the Shadowlands off from the lands between, it was actually part of the same continent. I've seen various maps on Twitter putting the pieces together, and here's a great one presented by Cole_AL on Reddit. The suppressing pillar found in the gravesite plains of the DLC also specifically states, the very center of the lands between, all manner of death wash up here only to be suppressed. Looking at this larger 2-scale map of the lands between, with the Shadowlands integrated into it by Cole_AL, it's clear that the suppressing pillar is at the center of the various divine towers. So going off of that, we find dragons scattered throughout the lands, but highly concentrated in Caelid and the Dragon Barrow, as well as the connected jagged peak of the DLC. This is all the eastern side of the lands between, so it makes sense that there would also be many dragons populating the northeast, with these becoming ice dragons. We know from Borealis' Mist that ice dragons also ruled the icy lands to the north, and it was likely during this very same period. Another element we find in Far Missoula are the beastmen who reside in Far Missoula and worship the dragons. Either through the dragons or of their own evolution, these beastmen gained 5 fingers, and through this, intelligence. Having gained intelligence, the beasts must have felt how their wildness slipped away as civilization took hold. Through item descriptions and keen observations by the Tarnished Archaeologist, we can find that the beasts seem to have gone through their own evolution, and eras similar to human history. It is said, in the time before the Erdtree, stones were the first weapons of the beasts who had gained intelligence. During the rule of the dragons, the beasts progressed through their own Stone Age and Bronze Age, and at the very least, as the beastman's cleaver is made of iron, reached an Iron Age. To give you an idea of how long this could have been, in real human history, the Stone Age is thought to have lasted millions of years, and the Bronze Age roughly 3,800 years. At least at the time, these beastmen were far more advanced than humankind, as, from the beastman's cleaver, it's clear the beastmen possessed knowledge beyond human ken. After all, this is humans' prehistory. But mankind would indeed arise. There are many ruins of human cultures that can be found throughout the lands between, and a rich history that we know very little about. It's likely this is when the Claymen were most prominent as they searched for revelation in service of the ancient dynasty. Their weapons are simple and unadvanced, which is a sign of early culture. While we know very little of these ancient cultures, it's likely the civilization of Ra existed around this period, and can give us a small glimpse into some of these cultures. We know for certain that these ruins are especially ancient, as the Antiquity Scholar's Cookbook tells us that even Horn-sent academics studied these ruins as ancient. Specifically, the culture worked with sprites, and the practice was thought lost to antiquity, placing this time period as especially ancient. These cultures created burrows for placing spiritual sprites into, and for using as part of their rituals. A sprite, by the way, would be akin to the same thing as a fairy. Specifically, in Elden Ring, we know that of all the sprites, the fire sprites are said to be the most boisterous in nature. So these sprites had their own personalities, and they were used in rituals. It seems the people of Ra didn't hold much reverence for the sprites, as their bondstones were a ritual implement made to control explosions of spiritual power. They'd cause a spiritual explosion, consuming the sprite dwelling within Sprite Stone. Bonds with the sprites were made to be broken. So they didn't seem to mind destroying the sprites for their own purposes, and as far as I can find, this is all we really know. But I do think it shows, compared to later studies of the Crucible and spells, a very primitive and barbaric understanding of how to create magic. While it's possible the Titans I mentioned previously also existed sometime during this period, a more important figure can be found in the form of a statue. We see no mention of this figure throughout the base game or DLC, but the figure can be found all over the lands between, from Siofra River to the Grand Cloister and even in Liurnia. Credit where credit is due, all observations of this I gleaned from watching Smoughtown and the Tarnished Archaeologist. This figure has been lovingly called Elden John within the community. This figure is depicted clutching to a broken stone tablet, while another broken tablet rests at his feet. The tablet at his feet mimics the real-world Imago Mundi, or Babylonian world map, and depicts the known world to the Babylonians. Meanwhile, the tablet he still clutches contains an image of a tree. It is likely this was a prophet who prophesied the coming Erdtree, and as Tarnished Archaeologist suggests, the old outdated world map that is at the prophet's feet could show a change and progression in culture, out with the old and in with the new, a new belief in a coming great tree. Interestingly, we can also find this prophet depicted in Liurnia amongst the four belfries, now older and with a great tree under him, his prophecy come true. While humans were going through their own evolutionary process, there were tumultuous wars happening to the north. At the mountaintop of the giants, there was another race living alongside the ice dragons, the Zamor. While we know very little about them, I believe they might have allied themselves with the ice dragons. However, the ice dragons were once lords of the mountaintops long ago, until they were defeated by the fire giants and chased from the peak. The fire giants took control of the land, however, they would continue to battle with the Zamor. Cloaked in icy tempests, the Knights of Zamor have challenged the fire giants since ancient times. The reason I think the Zamor coexisted with the ice dragons prior is partially due to what we learned from the Zamor armor set. These long-lived warriors, clad in biting, freezing winds, are said to have been mortal enemies of the fire giants since time immemorial. A question I do wonder is when the ancestral followers started to appear, and I find it likely that it was in this time, before worship of the Erdtree began, and probably before worship of the Crucible. They have their own distinct culture, and they likely rejected the ideas of the prophet who spoke of a coming great tree. But of course, this is speculation on my part. What we do know for certain is that they were horned, symbolizing influence from the Crucible, and they eschewed metalworking. Like other ancient cultures, their weapons are far more primitive. Unlike future cultures we'll see, who worship the Crucible and horns in their own fashion, the ancestral followers believe that the horns of a long-lived beast continue to bud like antlers over and over again until the beast one day becomes an ancestral spirit. They had their own practices and beliefs around horns, death, and rebirth. In their culture, death isn't necessarily a negative thing, and they believe life comes from death. And horns, in particular, are symbolic of this. A number of new growths bud from the antler-like horns of the fallen king, each glowing with light. Thus does new life grow from death, and from death, one obtains powers. In fact, not having horns or budding is considered so negative in this culture, as I believe this would mean there's no rebirth, that they have their own weapon, a winged great horn, meant to take the lives of beings who do not sprout horns. In the ancestral spirit-worshipping faith, those are considered envoys' wings, made to reap the lives of beings which experience no sprouting.
Now, the ancestral followers definitely do exist at the same time as the Erdtree and the Tarnished. We have item descriptions that link the two.
But I do believe the culture itself started prior to the Erdtree, and I find it likely that it would have been in ancient times before worship of the Crucible or Erdtree was so commonplace, a time their unique culture could flourish. Another series of cultures that possibly existed in this time frame are of a ruling class of birds. We know of several important birds: stormhawks, divine birds, twin birds, and death birds. The Stormhawk King Ashes tell us that he was revered by all others as sovereign back in the days when Stormvale's winds still raged like no other. This ancient monarch is proud, however, and I think it's very possible that the Stormhawk King reigned around this time. Shield featuring a vividly painted twin bird. The twin bird is said to be the envoy of an outer god and mother of all death birds. We also know that the Hornsent would look up to the heavens for the Crucible, and the divine birds, in particular, were something that they took heavy inspiration from. It could have been around this time that the death birds and their customs around death became commonplace. A death bird is depicted as a malevolent deity. The birds are graveyard firekeepers. It is said they rake out the ashen remains of the dead from their kilns. In particular, they would use ghost flame to burn away the dead. In the time when there was no Erdtree, death was burned in ghost flame. Death birds were the keepers of that fire. This custom would persist, and both superstition and symbolism around this can be found all around the lands between. As the eras progressed, more varied and vibrant cultures emerged, with many of these now centering around a worship of the Crucible and, for others, the stars. As humankind advanced, they naturally grew curious about where they came from, and a certain sect of astrologers began setting up camps high up to study the stars. They established themselves in mountaintops that nearly touched the sky and considered the fire giants their neighbors. It was through this study that a breakthrough was made, in particular, the founding reign of stars. The eldest primeval sorcery, said to have been discovered by an ancient astrologer, thought to be the founding glintstone sorcery. The glimpse of the primeval current that the astrologers saw became real, and the stars' amber rained down on this land. There are several ways to interpret this. You could think that the stars' amber that rained down was the sorcery itself, and hence the recognition and ability to use glintstone sorcery. Another viewpoint could be that, as we start to see the Crucible being related to something in the sky, perhaps this primeval current is the Crucible becoming a reality in the lands between. Yet another point of view could be that this was meteors and comets raining down, with some hitting the lands between and bringing forth extraterrestrial life. I honestly don't know the correct interpretation, but I think it's worth bringing forth multiple viewpoints. Either way, we have humans discovering primitive sorcery, astrologers advancing, and another step forward in civilization. Meanwhile, let's turn our attention to the followers of the Crucible, beginning with the Divine Bird Warriors. If you recall, it's my belief that the Crucible has existed since the very beginning, and where all life in the lands between come from. However, there is definitely valid speculation that this is the point when the Crucible arose. After all, the Crucible of life is the primordial form of the Erdtree. The Divine Bird Warriors would seem to be one of the initial starting points of where the Hornsent and followers of the Crucible began. From the Divine Bird Warrior Ornsis succeeded in taming the Divine Bird and made its wings his own as he soared through the sky. When he finally fell to the earth, he lived on as the guardian deity of the Temple Quarter. So we have Divine Bird Warriors who are said to have tamed divine birds, and importantly, both these Divine Bird Warriors and their technique of Divine Bird feathers are said to bear resemblance to the Golden Crucible. And from the Divine Bird Warriors derive the Horned Warriors of the Hornsent. From various item descriptions, we learned that the Divine Bird Warriors were the very first of all Horned Warriors, and are whom the Horned Warriors claim descent from. The Hornsent believed that the Crucible and divine powers from it seemed to come from some point in the sky, and found great importance in the shape of a spiral. After all, the spiral is a normalized Crucible current that, one day, will form a column that stretches to the gods. So the Hornsent built a giant spiraling tower, likely with the idea that it would indeed stretch to the gods. and to guard their tower, they placed the Horned Warriors, said to have descended from the Divine Bird Warriors, who were therefore closely related to the Crucible. Horned Warriors were heavily armored guardian spirits of the tower and attained inhuman strength through divine invocation. In the tower, these warriors and their weapons both are spiritual vessels. Notably, their helmet was a crown of sturdy tangled horns, allowing the wearer to invoke divinity. The Hornsent saw the divine in horns, and especially twisted tangled horns, which makes sense considering what we know of the Crucible. Various talismans, like the Crucible Knot Talisman, tell us that they're fashioned from a bony knot that embodies the aspects of various creatures. And from aspects of the Crucible was where all life once blended together. Hornsent viewed the Crucible as sacred for the refinement wrought through its evolutionary gifts, most prominently their tangled horns. And they wouldn't necessarily be mistaken about this. After all, the Crucible has a particularly strong influence on the beasts of the Realm of Shadow, causing many to grow horns despite the characteristics of their species. So it seems that horns are indeed a signifier of influence from the Crucible. So, the Hornsent became a dominating culture of the lands between, with a rich culture based on the intertwining of life and worship of the skies. The divine beast lines are adorned with horns, and they dance in these costumes at tower festivals. Divine beasts are messengers of the heavens, and their rage mirrors the tumult of the skies, of which storms are the pinnacle. Living alongside the Hornsent were the Numen, supposed descendants of denizens of another world, long-lived but seldom born. In descriptions of the Numen from the base game, they're referred to as being from outside the lands between. However, personally, I believe these refer to the time after the lands between and Shadowlands were separated from one another. It's possible this area didn't even become known as the lands between until after Marika and the Erdtree's involvement. These Numen had their own village, and in the time of the Hornsent were known as Shaman. These Shaman had a very particular power that separated them from others, and was of particular interest to the Hornsent, who worshipped the Crucible, which was the merging of life. The flesh of shamans was said to meld harmoniously with others. In other words, shaman and their kin had the power of grafting themselves to others.
So, while the Hornsent could possibly worship this ability, instead they had a rather twisted way of dealing with it.
The Hornsent decided to forcibly turn shamans into what they viewed as saints. So, at Bonnie Village, potentates would perform a divine ritual. This ritual being to take shamans and whip them with a tooth that would poison them and cause the wounds to grow inflamed and ooze pus, seemingly to force the shamans into more harmonious grafting. They then use butchering knives to dismember human bodies in the making of the great jars stored in the jails, and would stuff the shaman into a giant pot alongside all manner of other things to graft them all together. In other words, life melded together just like the Crucible. For pity's sake, your place is in the jar. Nigh sainthood itself await you within. For shamans like you, this is your lot. Life were you accorded for this alone. It didn't seem to only be shaman they would force together as one either. At the top of Bellerot Tower Settlement and the spiral-shaped Nir Ilum, there's a Gate of Divinity in order to access the Divine Crucible. Here, hundreds, if not thousands of bodies have been bound together to create the Gate of Divinity, although it's unclear they created it, or another central figure. Now, something I've been pondering quite a lot is where to place the Nox, and I'm leaning towards placing them here early on. My reasoning is, in part, due to Commander Gaius. We know that Commander Gaius was cursed at birth, specifically, he was an Albinauric. We also know that Radahn viewed him as an older brother, and he was a friend of Mesmer, although that does mean that he could still be far younger than Mesmer and older than Radahn. There's a pretty big time span between their births. Another element is that the Fingerslayer blade is directly correlated to them. This blood-drenched fetish is proof of the high treason committed by the Eternal City and symbolizes its downfall. Cannot be wielded by those without a fate, but is said to be able to harm the Greater Will and its vassals. We also know that the Nox were related to the Numen, which was the same race as Marika, and therefore the Shaman. At some point in time, this race did something that angered the Greater Will, forcing them underground. Long ago, the Nox invoked the ire of the Greater Will and were banished deep underground. Now they live under a false night sky, in eternal anticipation of their liege, of the coming age of the stars, and their Lord of Night. I ponder if, perhaps, it was the Nox who injured Metter, and this was who they used the Fingerslayer blade against, which is what invoked the ire of the Greater Will and forced them underground. It also could explain, in part, why the Hornsent treat the shaman with such disdain. That said, this is all purely speculation, and simply my reasoning for placing the Nox here. What is important, though, is that this race was forced underground. The Nox followed the Black Moon, and apparently, the Moon of Noxtella was the guide of countless stars. So I think it's fair to say that many stars that would hit the lands between were a direct result of the Nox. They could have been the reason that a star would hit Farum Azula, causing it to crumble since time immemorial, but of course, we don't truly know if these events are related. Even after being banished underground, the Nox continued to find ways to create things that countered the Greater Will and its influence, and they're also, in the future, related to helping Ranni bring about an Age of Stars. I believe they were the ones who created the Silver Tears. After all, Mimic Tears are the result of an intent by the Eternal City to forge a lord. On top of this, it seems highly likely they were the ones who would create the Albinorics. Albinorics are life forms made by human hands, thus many believe them to live impure lives untouched by the Erdtree's grace. While I'm on the topic of the Nox, another event that I can't place but was important was the arrival of Estelle. As Estelle arrived on a star, the one thing we can say for certain is that Estelle came after the Nox and their society had been banished underground and built up their cities, but before Radahn would become the Star Scourge and arrest the cycles of the stars. That is a huge time frame, and this likely happens somewhere later on, but as we're talking about the Nox here, let's discuss it now. At some point in time, a malformed star born in the flightless void far away once destroyed an eternal city and took away their sky, a falling star of ill omen. This star was likely attracted to the eternal city thanks to the city's dark moon. Estelle decimated one of the Nox's 3 underground cities, even destroying the star sky above it. One of Estelle's attacks is duplicating itself, which could be why we find multiple Estelles in the lands between. Now, there's another reason I brought up the Nox here, and that's due to an aspect of their culture we can find in their cities. Along the walls can be found merged together beings, perhaps Nox themselves, similar to the Gate of Divinity, which neatly leads us into the next section.
Do you recall what I said? That Marika and the fingers that guided her were unsound from the start.
Born in the shaman village was Marika. Unlike the other shaman, Marika seemed to gain guidance by the 2 fingers. This isn't exactly extraordinary, considering the finger ruin of Deo is near the shaman village, but something we can find by visiting the finger ruins is the Cerulean Seed Talisman +1, which tells us the Erdtree seeded this talisman was presumed to be an object of myth. The age-old artifact also depicts the 2 fingers, perhaps hearkening back to the birth of the Erdtree. There's another interesting element near the shaman village. A meteor struck nearby, and a falling star beast can be found at the site of the meteor. So, and this is pure speculation, fitting these pieces together, what if another meteor struck near the shaman village, and the first shaman who happened upon that meteor was a young Marika who discovered here a seed, the seed of the Erdtree? Going down this line of speculation, perhaps the fingers guided Marika to use this seed and combine it with the Crucible of Life, which would give birth to the Erdtree. What we know for certain, though, is that Marika somehow tricked and betrayed her way into power.
Mikula the Kind spoke of the beginning. The seduction and the betrayal. An affair from which gold arose. And so too was Shadow born.
It's unclear who Marika seduced and who she betrayed. Did she seduce the Hornsent with some sort of promise, and this is how she gained access to the Gate of Divinity? The tower and gate are rigorously guarded by the Hornsent, so it seems unlikely she would have been able to access it without them authorizing it. And speaking of the Gate of Divinity, it's also very possible that Marika herself created this. In Akron, the Nox, who are Numen and therefore of the same stock as Marika, have fused together bodies in their walls. So it draws the question, was it the Hornsents who built the Gate of Divinity? Or was it perhaps Marika, and maybe this was how Marika enticed the Hornsent to allow her up to the top of Anir Ilum? We know from the Secret Rite Scroll a little glimpse at how the Divine Gateway works. A lord will usher in a god's return, and the lord's soul will require a vessel. With this, she was able to ascend to godhood. Something to ponder. The Secret Rite makes it sound like a person would have to step through the Divine Gateway to become a god, and then need a lord who requires a vessel to return. But we see Marika doing something interesting in the story trailer to the Gates of Divinity with her strings and what at least are reminiscent of strands of the Elden Ring. She takes her pose that we know of, and we also have no idea who Marika's vessel is. It makes me wonder if this was the original sin. Perhaps Marika did something she shouldn't have with the rite, becoming both a god and her vessel. Perhaps this is what created Radagon, and why she and Radagon are one and the same. Although that's my own speculation. Something else interesting I want to point out is that you don't technically need the Elden Ring to ascend into godhood. After all, Mikkel is able to perform the same ascension without it. Perhaps it was this that was the original sin, becoming a god without the Elden Ring. From Mikkela's Great Rune, Mikkela set off for the tower enshrouded by shadow, abandoning everything, his golden flesh, his blinding strength, even his fate, all in an effort to bury the original sin, to embrace the whole of it, and be reborn as a new god. So if I'm interpreting this correctly, he'd remove everything reminiscent of the original sin, the things Marika gave him from her godhood, his fate being that of Empyrean of the Two Fingers, then embrace the original sin to be reborn as a new god. Nowhere here is the Elden Ring or influence of the fingers mentioned. To me, that speaks to the original sin perhaps being becoming a new god sans the Elden Ring. While the threads Marika strings up in the story trailer are certainly reminiscent of the golden threads of the Elden Ring, it's unclear how or when she obtained it. Some possible scenarios I could lay out. Farum Azula at some point is struck by a meteor, which is why it's perpetually crumbling. Could this very same meteor be the one that struck next to the shaman village? And if so, could it also somehow struck the Elden Beast and Elden Ring, bringing them both to her doorstep? Or perhaps I was wrong that the golden star with the golden beast struck during the Age of Dragons, but rather it was this golden star that struck next to her village. And somehow the dragons had everything they needed to rise to Elden Lord thanks to Metter, Mother of Fingers. It's also possible that there was some sort of rebellion or theft of the Elden Ring from the dragons. Finally, maybe if I'm correct about the Erdtree seed, maybe that's what this was, and Marika didn't actually have the Elden Ring yet, and wouldn't obtain it until just prior to Leyndell's war with the dragons. I find this to be the most likely, simply because Marika had 2 children before she'd meet Godfrey, yet Godfrey became the first Elden Lord, not Radagon, so I think she might have now been operating as a god sans the Elden Ring.
You can see, even after writing this and putting all of this together, I'm still not fully sure where I stand.
No matter which of these events took place, one thing was for certain. Marika became a god, and it's very likely at this point, she also had a second version of herself become a reality, Radagon. The dual entities of Elden Ring are a little hard for me to wrap my head around in terms of how they work, but we do know for certain that Radagon is Marika, and they are one and the same. It seems from the end of the base game of Elden Ring that Marika and Radagon also share the same body, with them turning into each other. And I believe this is when the Age of Plenty began. While Marika would meet Horalu early into her reign, thanks to new information we've gained from the DLC, I find it likely there was an entire period before Horalu where Marika was a god, the Erdtree was new, and Marika's influence hadn't become so widespread. The Age of Plenty was a wondrous time for the residents of the lands between. The Erdtree was brand new, and its sap would drip down onto the lands below, granting all nearby in the lands between golden grace. From the Blessed Dew Talisman, it was once thought that the blessed sap of the Erdtree would drip from its boughs forever, but that Age of Plenty swiftly came to a close. The icon shield depicts the Age of Plenty, and from it we see a far smaller Erdtree, and one where a resident is bowing to it with a chalice to get its sacred tear. Interestingly, there's also a Shadow Tree chalice set up below the Shadow Tree, also clearly meant to collect this sacred dew. But prior to the Shadow Realms separating from the lands between, this could have perhaps been a grand chalice built to gather sap from the Erdtree. During the Age of the Erdtree, these tears were used to spread the faith, for theirs was once a certain blessing. So Marika used the power of the Erdtree and its tears to spread her gospel, and people must have flocked to her religion, for we, as players, can see the great power of grace in the Erdtree. In fact, we use it the entire game, from the challenges that we use to heal ourselves, to the power of grace we use to level up and gain strength. It's during this period that Marika and Radagon gave birth to 2 children, Mesmer and Melina. However, both were born cursed with fire. Not exactly the greatest thing for someone whose entire religion is based around a giant tree. The eldest was Mesmer. Mesmer was born with a base serpent as a part of him, and one that Marika sealed away within him. The abyssal serpent was a curse he was born with, and very possibly the influence of an outer god, similar to Melania's curse from the rock goddess. However, even so, it remained. Mesmer despised his own fire. Time and time again he hoped to rid himself of it, but ever did it burn. Not only that, but Mesmer, much like his younger sister, bore a vision of fire. Which brings us to Melina. It has long been suspected that Melina was another child of Marika, and this one item description gives us that connection that many were hoping for. I believe, like Mesmer, Melina was also born prior to Godfrey and Marika's union, and born to Marika and Radagon. And it's Melina, who bore a vision of fire, who is the one able to burn the Erdtree.
Farewell it is then.
She also uses the minor Erdtree incantation if you summon her to fight alongside you, which we now know is an early incantation of Marika's. Speaking on Melina, similar to how Mesmer has one eye sealed by Marika and another sealed shut, Melina also has one eye sealed shut. If players choose the Frenzied Flame ending, we discover what's beneath that sealed eye. Melina's eye shines with darkness and dusk, indicating that Melina is likely another central figure to the lore, the Gloam-Eyed Queen. However, I don't think anything related to the Gloam-Eyed Queen happened quite yet. What did happen was a culture around the Erdtree, and I believe this is when the great city of Leyndell was built. As the city of Leyndell was built around this time, we now need to discuss the Frenzied Flame. From the fingerprint stone shield, it's part of the tomb of an ancient god. The readerless fingers relayed their message through these imprints, said to be the very seeds from which Frenzy first sprouted. Leyndell is built directly on top of this tomb, which is where the 3 fingers can be found. So it's possible the followers of Marika and the Erdtree imprisoned them here, built their swords on top, then built Leyndell on top of that, all to hide away something that could potentially burn it all.
The words of the 3 fingers. As your maiden, allow me to divine them. All that there is came from the one great. Then came fractures, and births, and souls. But the greater will made a mistake. Torment, despair, affliction, every sin, every curse, every one born of the mistake. And so, what was borrowed must be returned, melted all away with the yellow chaos flame, until all is one again.
Ah, may chaos take the world. May chaos take the world!
It does make me wonder why the 3 fingers was here. We know that Metter, Mother of Fingers, was broken and abandoned. Could the 3 fingers have been a part of her? Could the Nox have used the Fingerslayer blade on a certain set of fingers, cutting off and creating the 3 fingers, hence drawing the ire of the greater will? Or could it be none of these things? I don't know, but for the sake of this timeline, I think it's fair to say that the tomb with the 3 fingers now exists by this point. Notably, the Crucible was accepted during this period of time, and it's very likely that the Hornsent were even allied with Marika, perhaps not realizing that she harbored a deep-seated resentment towards them for their treatment of the shamans. We know various Crucible Knights would later serve Godfrey, and like many budding religions, Marika and her Erdtree likely accepted and perhaps even incorporated aspects of the Crucible within it. To make a real-world connection, this isn't unsimilar to how in Christianity, Christmas is likely an evolution of the Roman Empire's winter solstice celebrations. Rather than, at least immediately, stamping out the competition, it's better to incorporate meaningful events into your own new religion. Moving away from Marika for a moment, let's discuss those astrologers who had found glintstone sorceries in the stars and the cosmos. Glintstone sorcerers were descendants of the ancient astrologers, and these sorcerers spread to outer regions to further study glintstone. In Caelid, sorcerers, likely associated with the Nox, founded Celia, Town of Sorcery, In Liurnia, there's a family of Carians who also studied sorcery. It's my opinion that at this point, Carians weren't considered royal, but rather a family and perhaps town of sorcerers. The Academy Gate Town might have already existed at this point as well. These two sects of sorcerers came together and founded the Academy of Rea Lucaria, built upon a giant outcrop of glintstone. It's very possible that the coming or discovery of the Crystallians also happened around this time. The Crystallians are inorganic beings, yet they live. They cleave close to the ideals of the primeval current, and as such, they are revered guests of the sorcerers. And, of course, as the sorcerers studied the primeval current, their interest in the Crystallians would make sense. Now, to be clear, all of these events with the sorcerers, as far as I'm aware, could have happened prior to where I'm placing this, or even later on the timeline. The Age of Plenty was known for the abundance of dew dripping from the fresh new tree, but eventually this dew would dry up. The Erdtree's old sap becomes amber, treasured as the most precious of jewels in the Age of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. A primordial life energy resides inside. This tells me that by the time of Godfrey's reign, the Age of Plenty was over. It was now a period when the sap was old and becoming amber. So let's touch on Godfrey. At some point between the Age of Plenty and Age of the Erdtree, Marika would meet a great warrior from the Badlands, Haralu. Their union isn't really explained, but at some point, Marika would have children with Haralu and make him her consort. This could have been out of love, or perhaps because he was the strongest warrior, and it was her way to ally with someone who could further her means of expanding her dynasty. When Haralu vowed to become a lord, he took the beast regent Sarash upon his back to suppress the ceaseless lust for battle that raged within him, and became Godfrey. Godfrey served as Marika's lord, obliterating her foes. In the beginning, everything was in opposition to the Erdtree, but through countless victories in war, it became the embodiment of order. One of the very first and most important of these was the war with the giants. It's pretty likely, in my opinion, that the Grand Lift of Rold was built specifically around this period, so Marika could bring her forces up onto the mountaintop of the giants in order to face the giants. The first cardinal sin is burning of the Erdtree, and on the mountaintop of the giants resided one-eyed giants imbued with the flame of the fell god, a flame powerful enough to burn the Erdtree. Marika and Godfrey waged a campaign against these giants, allying with their ancient enemies, the Zamor. They were also able to get the giants' very own descendants, the Trolls, to betray the giants and ally alongside them.
Hark, brave warriors. Hark, my lord Godfrey. We commend your deeds. Guidance hath delivered ye through each ordeal to the place ye stand. Put the giants to the sword and confine the flame atop the mount. Let a new epoch begin, an epoch glistening with life. Brandish the Elden Ring for the age of the Erdtree.
Something I've been wondering, by the way, is that line about brandishing the Elden Ring.
Brandishing would be waving something, like a weapon, menacingly. It's a big part of why I've been unclear if Marika already has the Elden Ring at this point. Because on one hand, you can say that they already have the Elden Ring here, and they're brandishing it at the fire giants, taunting them with it.
But for some reason, in my brain, I read this as them not having it yet. To me, it feels like her saying they're going to defeat the fire giants, then brandish the Elden Ring. So this is her obtaining the Elden Ring, then brandishing it and taunting it like, ha ha ha, we got this.
Going off that idea, perhaps the giants obtained the Elden Ring from the dragons, and the Fell God was using it. Or, as this is how the player reaches Farum Azula, Marika had to defeat the giants in order to obtain the Elden Ring. Finally, it's also possible I'm incorrect about all of this, and Marika had the Elden Ring all along. It does make sense to me, though, that after the Age of Plenty, Marika would want to power up her Erdtree, and infusing the Elden Ring was a great way to do that. But this is purely speculation at this point. Moving forward, it is said that Marika herself slayed the Fell God of the One-Eyed Giants, and with their defeat, the last surviving fire giant was punished. The fire giant is a survivor of the war against the giants. Upon realizing the flames of their forge would never die, Queen Marika marked him with a curse. O trifling giant, mayst thou tend thy flame for eternity. On top of the fire giant guarding the flame, Marika also set up fire monks to guard and watch over the flame, and likely also the fire giant itself. With the defeat of the fire giants and the Elden Ring in hand, Marika began truly spreading the religion centered around her Erdtree, building churches. and we can trace these churches to see the path. The first Church of America can be found, fittingly, in the mountaintop of the Giants, likely established either during the battle, where she gave her rousing speech, or afterwards in the same location to commemorate her speech. The second Church of America can be found just west of Landell on the Altus Plateau. Further south, the third Church of America can be found in the Mistwood of Limgrave. Finally, the fourth Church of America can be found on the Weeping Peninsula to the south. I think all of this spread was a result of Godfrey's conquests. But before he would leave, Godfrey America had 3 children, the Golden Lineage. These were Godwyn the Golden, Morgott, and Moog. The first demigods were the Elden Lord Godfrey and his offspring, the Golden Lineage. Godfrey would also establish various colosseums, beginning with one in Landell. Eventually, he would travel southwest on various conquests in the name of America, establishing the various churches I mentioned. First, he traveled to Stormvale and Limgrave, where he defeated the Stormlord. It's very possible that he was the one who had Stormvale Castle built while he was there, and also built the nearby Colosseum while spending time in Stormvale. And I believe it was during this period of time, while Godfrey was traveling, that another war would take hold of Landell, the War Against the Dragons. At some point, the ancient dragons attacked Landell. A great ancient dragon, Grandsax, once rained calamity upon the royal capital, the only time in historical record that Landell's walls have fallen. This marked the dawn of the War Against Dragons. Ancestors of the modern dragons, the ancient dragons had scales of gravel stone and wielded lightning as their weapon. It is said they once attacked Landell, the royal capital. While we never learn why, to me, it makes sense that the reason could be that they wanted the Elden Ring back, and it might have seemed like an opportune time to strike while Godfrey, their current champion, was gone on his conquests.
That said, this is a lot of speculation here. This is just me putting pieces together, as Godfrey is, for some reason, never mentioned in this particular war, which seems odd.
One thing the dragons didn't count on, though, was the power of Godfrey's son, Godwyn the Golden. While Grandsax destroyed the walls of Landell, in the end, Landell's forces were able to defeat the dragon, whose corpse still remains in the city, and another attacking dragon was taken on by Godwyn. Long ago, Godwyn the Golden defeated the ancient dragon Fortisax and befriended his fallen foe, an event that gave rise to the ancient dragon cult in the capital. All in all, Landell was able to stave off the dragons and win their war. Due to Godwyn's befriending Fortisax, a dragon cult started within Landell, and Lansseax, sister to Fortisax, took the form of a human to commune with the knights as a priestess of the ancient dragon cult. This worship was tolerated because, of course, both ancient dragons and Landell would get their powers from the Elden Ring and Greater Will. The worship of the ancient dragons does not conflict with belief in the Erdtree. After all, the seal and lightning itself are both imbued with gold. Also of note are the Crucible Knights. These Crucible Knights served Godfrey, indicating that the Crucible and aspects of it were still tolerated during this period of time. During the age of the Erdtree, America seemed highly involved in the lives of her citizens. It is said that when the age of the Erdtree began, blessings such as Erdtree's favor were personally bestowed upon their recipients by Queen Marika herself. However, not all was grand and good, and in particular, the sorcerers were not fond of the age of the Erdtree. Around this time, in Liurnia, Rennala would discover her moon. The young astrologer gazed at the night sky as she walked. She had always chased the stars every step of her journey. Then she met the full moon, and in time, the astrologer became a queen. As children, both Rennala and her younger sister, Rellana, met the twin moons, overlapping as they nestled against one another. Rennala was a Carian, and her discovery of sorceries in the moon was so major, she charmed the Academy with her lunar magic, becoming its master. She also led the Glintstone Knights and established the House of Caria as royalty. So the Carians became royal, Rennala became a queen, and simultaneously, the new master of the Academy of Rhea Lucaria. But during her tenure, the Erdtree would cause direct conflict with the study of the stars. After all, a giant glowing object tends to create light pollution at night and obscure a view of the night sky. During the age of the Erdtree, Carian astrology withered on the vine. The fate once written in the night skies had been fettered by the Golden Order. So it's no wonder that the Liurnians refused to bend the knee. The Erdtree was in direct contrast with their study of the stars, and on a deeper level, the Abyss. So while Godfrey marched south conquering the Stormlord, the Liurnians refused to submit to the forces of the Erdtree, triggering the First and eventually Second Liurnian Wars, both of which Radagon, who we know as Marika, took part in. Now, something worth pondering here in the timeline is where is Godfrey? Godfrey hadn't yet been tarnished, and yet it's never mentioned what his role was, if any, in either of the Liurnian Wars. Given that, and this is of course my own personal headcanon, I think Godfrey was busy building up his kingdom in Limgrave after besting the Stormlord. He likely didn't partake in either Liurnian battle. As we know at the very end, Lord Godfrey at last at the end of his campaign, his golden armies unvanquished and unbowed, which would indicate he'd never been defeated. And as there were 2 Liurnian Wars, that would mean Godfrey never partook in the first. Marika and Godfrey likely weren't spending any time together during his conquests, so I think Marika took it into her own hands and went after Liurnia herself as Radagon, while Godfrey was out in Stormvale. I'm even going to place this prior to Godfrey heading south to the Weeping Peninsula and establishing the Fourth Church of Marika. It's even possible that both Godfrey and Marika/Radagon weren't in Leyndell during the attack of the Ancient Dragons. Either way, let's move on to something a little more concrete. While Radagon was fighting against Rennala and her forces from the Academy in the Second Liurnian War, something happened.
Lord Radagon was a great champion, possessed of flowing red locks. He came to these lands at the head of a great golden host. When he met Lady Rennala in battle, he soon repented his territorial aggressions there, and became husband to the Carian queen. Radagon once cleansed himself with celestial dew, repented his territorial aggressions, and swore his love to Rennala. The order of the Erdtree and the fate of the moon were conjoined, and all the wounds of war forgiven.
Radagon and Rennala fell in love. Or did they? We're directly told they fell in love, and I think we can say for certain that Rennala did indeed fall in love with Radagon. But it's tempting to wonder if perhaps Radagon actually married Rennala as a political move. After all, Marika had lost the First Liurnian War, hence why there was a second. And perhaps this was the only way, or easiest way, to enforce the order of the Erdtree in Liurnia.
But again, this is me reading between the lines. What we definitely know is that Radagon and Rennala married, and their houses united.
As a wedding gift, Radagon gifted Rennala the Great Rune of the Unborn. Something this has made me ponder a lot about are the Great Runes in general, and the Shard Bearers. Later on, the Elden Ring will be shattered and certain demigods inherit these shards. But some of it seems a little odd to me. For example, Ranni apparently had a Great Rune as well, but Ranni is the cause of Godwyn's death and she herself had no body, so why would she be given a shard or even have a Great Rune? We also know that Ranni is said to have cast aside her Great Rune, so it's not like she wanted one by the Shattering. Anyways, all of this is an oddity I felt was worth pointing out. Meanwhile, at some point either after or before this, and I'm going to place it after, Godfrey traveled south to the Weeping Peninsula, either building or taking over Castle Morn. We know that an unknown hero laid siege to Castle Morn for revenge, but failed at the hands of Godfrey. Marika was slowly but surely conquering all of the lands between. As Radagon, Marika and Rennala had 3 children, Radahn, Ranni, and Rykard. Once again, it's hard to say exactly when this particular event occurred, but another meteor struck, this time carrying with it Alabaster Lords, celestials who were masters of gravitational magic. It's worth saying, some people place this far earlier at the time when Farum Azula was struck by a meteor. With Sellia and likely much of Caelid now a part of Marika's empire due to the alliance with the Academy of Rhea Lucaria, Radahn left to study in Sellia, town of sorcery. Here, these Alabaster Lords taught gravitational spells to both a young Radahn and to Commander Gaius. In fact, Gaius was the most senior disciple of the same Alabaster Lord who taught Radahn gravitational techniques. Gaius and Radahn were good rivals in their youth, and Blades of Stone is a product of their friendly competition. Both Gaius and Mesmer were like older brothers to Radahn, with Mesmer eventually enlisting Gaius to be the commander and leader of his men. As Radahn was interested in war and becoming a great warrior himself, he also grew up idolizing Godfrey, who by then was considered the lord of the battlefield, and his armor would be designed to reflect Godfrey. Ranni, on the other hand, led by Rennala, encountered the moon. What she beheld was cold, dark, and veiled in occult mystery. She'd then go to meet a snow witch in the woods who would become her secret mentor, teaching her to fear the dark moon as she taught her cold sorceries. Rykard was the youngest of the three, and at some point would leave for Mount Gelmir, where he'd discover ancient lava hexes and utilize them. Rykard would become a justiciar for the Golden Order, where he would employ inquisitors to torture those whom were being questioned or had potentially betrayed them. His Volcano Manor itself is filled with secret rooms, likely so Rykard could question his enemies or supposed allies and torture information out of them. All of this earned him the title of Praetor Rykard. One inquisitor in particular was Inquisitor Giza, who'd use a device that would come to be called Giza's Wheel to torture. This wheel would end up being used for the iron versions of which Rykard created. Rykard would also create abductor versions who would transport those abducted right into his prison. Interestingly, these version contraptions seem to utilize snakes to control them, so it brings about the question of if these snakes were a result of influence by Messmer, as Messmer would have still been around during this period of time, given his relationship we know of with Radahn, or perhaps these serpents were something Rykard himself would discover, and more so an omen of things to come with the blasphemous serpent. Rykard would also travel to a foreign land where he would meet the dancer Lady Tanith. Long ago, when Rykard first set eyes on Tanith, she was working as a dancer in a foreign land. Soon he made her his consort. It's my personal opinion that this land could have been the Shadowlands where he met Lady Tanith, as we find a couple of iron virgins at the Fort of Reprimand, indicating Rykard could have potentially traveled here at some point. That said, it's also fully possible that Messmer took a couple iron virgins with him on his crusade in order to keep any potential traitors or deserters in line. It was also likely during this period of time that Crucible Knight Devonia would quest in search of the Crucible's origin and depart from the lands of the Erdtree alone. This bit of information is important, as the Shadowlands are at some point physically separated from the lands between, but the fact that the minor character of Crucible Knight Devonia was able to reach the Shadowlands, it indicates this hasn't happened yet. At some point in time during this period, Renala's younger sister, Ralana, would meet and become enchanted with Messmer. It's unclear what level of devotion she had for him, but I think it's pretty likely she fell in love with him, even if this love was unrequited.
I declare mine intent to search the depths of the Golden Order through understanding of the proper way. Our faith, our grace is increased. Those blissful early days of blind belief are long past. My comrades, why must ye falter?
It's my belief that as time progressed, just like how the Age of Plenty came to an end, the Erdtree itself was potentially starting to lose its radiance, and with it, more people came to question their faith. And with that, Marika required her followers slowly become more dogmatic. This could be, in part, why Praetor Rykard became an important part of the family, as he would torture and question those whose faith had faltered. I find it likely, as things continue to get more strict, that this could have been when a certain caravan of merchants was locked away. These merchants once thrived as the Great Caravan, but after being accused of heretical beliefs, the entire clan was rounded up and buried alive far underground. Then they chanted a curse of despair and summoned the Flame of Frenzy. The Great Caravan of Merchants were buried alive in a tomb at the location of the Three Fingers, an absolutely horrific punishment for anyone, and in despair, they collectively went mad, and it was this despair madness that brought forth the Flame of Frenzy. Either at the same time or before was Shabriri. It is said that the sickness of the Flame of Frenzy began with Shabriri, the most reviled man in all history. Shabriri had his eyes gouged out as punishment for the crime of slander, and with time, the blight of the Flame of Frenzy came to dwell in the empty sockets. I've seen multiple interpretations of the timeline and order of events for this, and I'd highly recommend checking out other lore videos focusing on the Frenzied Flame for this, but for our sake, I think it's likely we can place these events around this period of time. While Shabriri might have been the one who had said the sickness of the Flame of Frenzy began with, this could very well be in plain view in the lands between, as opposed to tucked away where the merchants were and hidden, for I think the Frenzied Flame seems to act like other outer gods, in that it can be visited by characters who experience enough despair, and specifically, in this case, those who go mad. We find Frenzy in places completely apart from one another, and I think in each instance, it was from a different group who went mad, and then it spread like a sickness. Shabriri went mad and spread madness in Liurnia. The Great Caravan of Merchants went mad with despair from their punishment for a crime they possibly never even committed. And in the Shadowlands, at Midra's Manse, we also see a spread of madness. In a distant land, in an age long past, was born a man who failed to become the Lord of Frenzied Flame. All that remains of him is cradled gently by Nanaya. The Lord of Frenzied Flame shall take their torment, despair, their affliction, every sin, every curse, all melted away. Midra's manse is locked away by Jory, Elder Inquisitor. His barbed staff spear's tip bristles with golden barbs symbolic of the Inquisition's torture, allowing one to wield the staff as a great spear. Various Inquisitors can be found at Midra's manse, so this indicates that the Hornsent Inquisitors tortured the members of the manse. Midra himself can be found with the great sword of damnation stuck into him. As the golden barbs inflicted eternal agony upon him, Midra held fast to Nanaya's entreaty. Endure. The word was a curse. This does make me wonder which came first. Was Midra and the members of the manse subject to an inquisition, and hence what led to their madness and the frenzied flame? Or was it the opposite, and the Inquisition came to suppress the frenzied flame? After all, the Great Sword of Damnation, which could be found in Midra, reads, used by the Hornsent in the execution of a damnation like no other. Outside of Midra's manse, we can find multiple people with their heads cut off, likely by the Inquisition. Eventually, everyone would either succumb to madness or be executed by the Inquisition. Everyone except for Midra, who continued to endure. Back to the Lands Between, another vital event would also take place. Lord Godfrey, at last at the end of his campaign, his golden armies unvanquished and unbowed, yet finds grace lost, tattered, and faded. Marika decided to strip Godfrey and all of his kin of the grace of gold.
I divest each of thee of thy grace. With thine eyes dimmed, ye will be driven from the lands between. Ye will wage war in a land afar, where ye will live and die. Then, after thy death, I will give back what I once claimed, return to the lands between, wage war, and brandish the Elden Ring, grow strong in the face of death. Warriors of my lord, Lord Godfrey.
So it seems Marika already plotted at this early stage for the coming return of the Tarnished. Why she ousted Godfrey though? Perhaps it was to spread her teachings in faraway lands. Perhaps it was for more and more offspring to be born so she would have a large army she could bring back. Perhaps a little bit of both, or neither.
As you've seen, a lot of this is up to speculation and interpretation, and even my placement of many of the events on the timeline are up to interpretation.
And speaking of which, while I know that many would place Radagon leaving to reunite with Marika immediately after this event, given what Muriel Pastor of Vows says,
when Godfrey, first Elden Lord, was hounded from the lands between, Radagon left Rennala to return to the Erdtree capital, becoming Queen Marika's second husband and king consort, taking the title of Second Elden Lord.
I don't think this happened immediately. I think there were a number of events that took place prior, and we have to keep in mind that, importantly, Messmer knows who the Tarnished are.
That Tarnished, it seemeth. Mother, wouldst thou truly lordship sanction in one so bereft of light?
So Messmer seemed to be around during the time Godfrey and his kin became the Tarnished and were ousted from the Lands Between. As the Tarnished were ousted, on the surface in the Lands Between, for no longer having the grace of gold, dogmatic views in religion in the Lands Between likely heightened. While it's unclear when exactly Moog and Morgott would have been hidden away underneath Leyndell, it's certain that this definitely would have happened by this point, for they were born Omen or born with horns. Omen babies born of royalty do not have their horns excised, but instead are kept underground, unbeknownst to anyone, imprisoned for eternity. While they would have been hailed as great beings back in the day of the Hornsent, now they were thought of as accursed, and negatively as omen. After all, horns are representative of the Crucible, and the Crucible was now deemed to be negative. It was considered a signifier of the divine in ancient times, but is now increasingly disdained as an impurity as civilization has advanced. Omen were so scorned that even babies were essentially tortured. Omen babies have all their horns excised, causing most to perish. and those omens that still did exist above ground were hunted down by the Omen Killers. And so, both Mohg and Morgott were shackled underground. Their shackles tell us that shackles were used to bind the accursed people called the Omen, and these ones were made to keep a particular Omen under strictest confinement. At the very least, we definitely know that the Omen Killers had surfaced by this point, for we can find them in the shadow of the Erdtree DLC, meaning some came along with Messmer in order to hunt and kill the Hornsent. So that means this superstition about the Omen definitely started prior to Radagon and Marika's reunion. However, I have no doubt that this period of time became the worst for anyone outside of the purview of Gold, including the Albinaurics. At some point, while Morgott and Mohg were chained underground, they were visited by the outer god, the Formless Mother. The Mother of Truth craves wounds. When Mohg stood before her deep underground, his accursed blood erupted with fire and besotted with the defilement that he was born into. While only Mohg is mentioned here, and he very specifically accepted this influence, Morgott was also visited, but rejected it. We know this because in Phase 2 of his boss fight, we see these powers come into play. And speaking on Messmer, it was around this time that Marika ordered Messmer on a crusade. On his mother's wishes, Messmer made himself a symbol of fear, undertaking the cleansing crusade she desired. Messmer was sent into the Shadowlands to wipe out the Hornsent, those whom had brutally tortured the shamans in the past. With him came his longtime friend, Commander Gaius, who would lead his men. Fire Knights, who all hailed from renowned families of the Erdtree's upper echelons, joined Messmer as well as Black Knights. A penal battalion was also sent alongside Messmer, away from Marika to rid her land of prisoners and force them to fight for her cause. All of them thinking they were leaving on a holy quest for Marika. Renala's younger sister, R'hllana, disavowed her birthright and chose to stand at Messmer's side instead, knowing full well that not even the brilliance of the moon could grant him succor. Before long, she became known as the Sword of Messmer. R'hllana, head of the royal family of Caria, was said to have given her younger sister, who renounced her lineage to chase after Messmer, a gift of lustrous black hair. Given that R'hllana was conscious enough to give R'hllana a gift, it speaks to these events occurring before Radagon would leave her, as that event would leave her a broken shell. Alongside R'hllana came her own faithful knights, also joining Messmer's crusade. They built giant wicker furnace golems to intimidate the Hornsent, putting visages of the fire giants on them. As this was viewed as a crusade, they partook on this for religious purposes, cleansing the world of all that wasn't gold. And it was here that Messmer and his soldiers would betray and slaughter the Hornsent.
What followed was a war unseen.
While Messmer's army was wiping out the Hornsent, I believe it was in this time frame that Marika put a veil over the Shadowlands, truly removing it from the lands between, and stranding Messmer and his followers in the Shadowlands. Marika had not only taken out the Hornsents whom had tortured her people in the past, but also rid herself of Messmer. Messmer, who had an abyssal serpent inside of him, and whom she feared so greatly, she abandoned her own firstborn son. A malevolent snake writhed within Messmer, and so his very mother plucked out his eye and put in its place a seal of grace. Yet having done so, her fear compelled her to secret away her child within the realm of shadow. Hidden away, keeping company with the original sin, and a hatred that would not be confined. She was also able to veil and hide away how she became a god in the first place, perhaps her original sin. After these events, the Formless Mother made another visit, this time to the Blood Fiends. We learn from the Outer God Heirloom that the clan who lost everything in the Great Fires peered upon the corpse of their ancestor, normally an act of sanctity, and saw in its shadow a twisted deity. The clan had suffered such torment that the horrible thing was taken as an object of worship. So it seems that the Formless Mother visits those whom have suffered great loss or torment. Perhaps this is how she can twist people into following her dark, bloody path. It seems to be out of a mix of anger, desperation, and sadness. And this wasn't the only visit from an outer god. Looking at Romana, Saint of the Bud, after the church was burned to the ground, Romana discovered a twisted divine element, which she weaved into the baleful scarlet rot. Perhaps then, the Bud might find somewhere to gain purchase once more within the scorched remains. And from the pole blade of Bud, once in the crumbling, burning church, Romana held the Bud in speechless silence. That Bud would become her blade. To me, it's pretty likely that her church was burned to the ground from Messmer's crusade, and I think, like the Blood Fiends, An outer god visited her, however for her, it was the one who bestowed rot. While Malenia is known as the goddess of rot, from the Blue Dancer's charm there was also an ancient god that was sealed away, a god that was rot itself. We also know from Miquella's unalloyed gold needle that it was a ritual implement crafted to ward away the meddling of outer gods. It is thought capable of forestalling the incurable rotting sickness, which would indicate that rot comes from an outer god, perhaps the very same ancient god who the Blue Dancer sealed away. As a result, the church and its surroundings would slowly fester with rot, kindred of rot would arrive, and Romana herself would be transformed into a grotesque centipede-esque creature. With Mesmer spirited away, I believe that this is when Melina and the Glomide Queen events took place. As I mentioned earlier, it's pretty likely that Melina is the Glomide Queen, and the Glomide Queen would rebel against the gods and demigods, but we never knew why. Again, purely speculation, but it's my belief that this was a direct result of Marika abandoning Mesmer. I can't imagine Melina would have viewed this in a positive light and would certainly have given her motivation to rebel. Melina created and led the Godskin Apostles, who would wield black flame created from destined death. The Glomide Queen cradles newborn apostles swaddled in this cloth. Soon they will grow to become the death of the gods. The apostles once said to serve destined death are wielders of the god-slaying black flame. Melina, who was an Empyrean herself, chosen by the Two Fingers, betrayed and attacked the gods. As a result, Malekith, Marika's shadow, defeated Melina and sealed destined death. But when Malekith sealed destined death, the true power of the black flame was lost. It would seem Melina was only killed in body and her spirit remained, something she would ponder upon.
I'm searching for my purpose, given to me by my mother inside the Erdtree, long ago, for the reason that I yet live, burned and bodiless.
In the end, Marika spared Melina's spirit, either out of love or foreseeing Melina might lead the Tarnished in the future. We do need to talk a little further about when this event took place. On one hand, it could have been far earlier, as we're told that Godskin nobles are the most ancient apostles who are said to have assimilated in human physiology, not unlike the Crucible, the Erdtree in its primordial form. So it's possible this could mean Godskin were the very first of any apostle, including ancient dragon apostles, which would place this event before the dragons invaded Leyndell. Or, and the way I'm currently interpreting this, nobles are simply the most ancient of the Godskin apostles specifically. I do think this event takes place later in the timeline, as I'm placing it, because there would have had to be several gods running around for the Godskin apostle to be effective or have any real meaning. So to me, that would indicate that the demigod children of Marika, like Godwyn the Golden, Rykard, Radahn, etc., would have had children who were also considered kind of gods, whom the Godskin apostle could have killed. After all, we know of Godefroy and Godric the Grafted, who are likely offspring of Godwyn the Golden, or even further down the line. They're considered part of the Golden lineage, but never mentioned as children of Godfrey. Wherever you place this event, it resulted in the major event of destined death being sealed away, which was a major turn for the gods, and completely changed the meaning of death in the lands between, while also creating the Golden Order. Marika's sole need of her shadow was a vessel to lock away destined death. And then, the Golden Order was created by confining destined death. It's curious to consider how this affected death overall. For the gods, like Marika and her children, it essentially meant they could no longer be killed. A weakness was found, and it was sealed away. By taking death out of the equation, it would seem that those who were granted grace seem to experience death in a new way. Their grace returns to the Erdtree, and they're buried at its base.
Your soul will return to the Erdtree in time. Honeyed rays of gold, deliver this spirit.
This seems to be in contrast with previous practices involving Ghost Flame. Another very important element of the Golden Order.
The Golden Order is founded on the principle that Marika is the one true god.
So what does that mean for the fate of the Empyreans? Those the Two Fingers choose to become gods. The Golden Order could also have to do with outer gods and the like, with Marika establishing that other religions and belief systems, such as those studied in the Stars and Raya Lucaria, were incorrect. Again, creating a dogmatic belief system. However, at the start of the Golden Order, it was nowhere near as strict as it would eventually become.
They were conceived at the Great Academy of Raya Lucaria, to the north of this castle. In the past, they obeyed laws which contravened the Golden Order. or so I'm told. Fascinating, isn't it? That the Golden Order was pliable enough to absorb practices that contradicted itself in the past.
This goes along with Marika accepting the Hornsent and Crucible worship at first before stomping this out. And slowly, she'd stomp out all competing beliefs. One more thing to mention, it's stated that Radagon, who we know as Marika, also studied sorceries in Raya Lucaria during this time period, in a way becoming more powerful. Sometime after Godfrey and his kin became tarnished, and Marika stripped them of their grace, Radagon returned to Leyndell, leaving Rennala. On the surface, Radagon replaced Godfrey as the new Elden Lord. This shattered Rennala and left her a broken mess. When Rennala, head of both the Academy of Raya Lucaria and the Carian royal family, lost her husband Radagon, her heart went along with him. Rennala would go out of her mind, and sometime between this and the Shattering, the Academy would rebel against both Rennala and the Carian royals.
And then, when the Academy rebelled against the royals, she was locked away in the Grand Library.
The Academy of Raya Lucaria hired the Cuckoo Knights as mercenaries to attack Caria. The soldiers of Raya Lucaria were also known as the Cuckoos. They were given free reign by the Academy to wage war as they pleased, and they were infamous for their rapacious ways. Fortunately for Caria, they had prepared for this very day. From the Carian Knight Shield, carried by knights who served the Carian royal family, excels when facing magic or holy attacks. Just who were these knights preparing to fight? And that seems to be answered in Carian retaliation. This was the Carian royal family's secret means to prepare against the disloyalty of the Academy. The moon and stars would one day go their separate ways.
When the Raya Lucaria Academy turned on the Carians, the Knights of the Cuckoo descended on this tract. After leveling it, they carried on to the manor. The Carians were taken off guard, but their strength had not waned and they repelled the Knights' onslaught.
While Caria Manor seemed to take heavy losses, they won out. Near Caria Manor, we find the resting place of the contemptible Cuckoos, lost in the siege of Caria Manor. Back in Leyndell, this would seem to be when Golden Order fundamentalism began. Radagon, who had studied sorceries while married to Rennala, studied incantations while married to Marika, and it seems this is the point that the Golden Order became far more rigid. If something wasn't gold or related to the Erdtree, it was vile and bad. Religious extremism began to reach its zenith under Golden Order fundamentalism. The fundamentalists describe the Golden Order through the powers of regression and causality. Causality is the pull between meanings. It is the connections that form the relationships of all things. Regression is the pull of meaning, that all things yearn eternally to converge. So looking at this, causality is typically linked with determinism. In other words, everything has a reason for happening, and typically, in causality, that would mean that there is no true free will. With this understanding of regression, that all things yearn eternally to converge, this likely has to do with all things converging back to the Erdtree, thanks to destined death being sealed away. All life eventually converges back together, ironically, similar to the Crucible. Even the very Crucible Knights who had served Godfrey were viewed poorly. In time, the strength shown by these knights and even their appearance was seen as chaotic and deserving of scorn. Radagon and Marika would have a second set of children, Miquella and Malenia. However, like Mesmer before, and likely Melina, both Miquella and Malenia were born cursed.
Queen Marika and her king consort Radagon were blessed with twin demigods, and Malenia was one of them. She was born an Empyrean carrying the Scarlet Rod.
Miquella and Malenia are both the children of a single god. As such, they are both Empyreans, but suffered afflictions from birth. One was cursed with eternal childhood, and the other harbored rot within. At the start, it seems Miquella followed the teachings of his parents, and in particular, Radagon, who was studying incantations. Miquella created Discus of Light, a gift from young Miquella to his father Radagon, and Radagon created Rings of Light, a gift of gratitude to the young Miquella from his father Radagon. In his youth, Miquella would watch his more powerful older siblings, and seemed to be especially enthralled by Radahn. In their childhood, Miquella saw in Radahn a lord, his strength and his kindness that stood in stark contrast with their afflicted selves. At some point, after Radagon left Rennala for Marika, breaking Rennala in the process, Ranni decided to rebel against Marika, the Two Fingers, the Golden Order, and all that Marika had come to establish. There's no specific reason given for why Ranni decided to rebel, but she does describe to us the order that she wants to create.
Mine will be an order not of gold, but the stars and moon of the chill night. I would keep them far from the earth beneath our feet. As it is now, life and souls and order are bound tightly together. But I would have them at a great remove, and have the certainties of sight, emotion, faith, and touch all become impossibilities, which is why I would abandon this soil with mine order.
A number of things here. For one, she specifically states one issue she has is that life, souls, and order are bound tightly together, with order very specifically being something that the Two Fingers in Elden Ring establish. This is very much me reading between the lines and speculating here, but I'd imagine that she likely has a bone to pick with Marika, as Radagon left her mother a fractured version of herself. She seems to have a deep love for her mother, as finishing the first phase of the Rennala boss fight has Ranni telling players,
"Upon my name is Ranni the Witch. Mother's rich slumber shall not be disturbed by thee. Foul trespasser. Send word far and wide. Of the last queen of Caria, Rennala of the full moon. And the majesty of the night she conjureth."
So I have to imagine that she's become disillusioned with the Golden Order and Greater Will as a whole. On top of that, she grew up a daughter of Rennala who discovered the full moon and was influenced by the old Snow Witch, who she seemed to study under as a child. The old Snow Witch of whom taught the young Ranni to fear the dark moon as she imparted her cold sorcery. Either way, she's decided to rebel and start an Age of the Stars.
1,000-year voyage under the wisdom of the moon.
However, something about the Two Fingers gives them a deep hold over chosen Empyreans. She's unable to start this age if her Two Fingers still lives, and perhaps she also can't ascend to godhood with her body, but needs to be in spirit alone. One issue is that Marika had removed the Rune of Death, meaning those with grace can no longer die. But there was a way. Ranni used the Black Knife Assassins to steal a fragment of the Rune of Death from Malekith, and then performed a ritual on their blades to turn them into black knives infused with the Rune of Death and capable of killing a god.
I am the witch, Ranni. I stole a fragment of the Rune of Death and used it to forge the god-slaying black knives through fearsome rite.
And she uses those black knives to murder Godwyn.
On a night of wintry fog, the Rune of Death was stolen. And the demigods began to fall. Starting with Godwyn the Golden.
But it wasn't only Godwyn. She also murdered herself, in a way.
I stole the Rune of Death, slew mine own Empyrean flesh, casting it away. I would not be controlled by that thing. The Two Fingers and I have been cursing each other ever since.
Godwyn and Ranni were killed at practically the same time, giving them both half of a curse mark of death. But something about the way that Ranni performed this ritual, or perhaps which weapon she chose to kill whom, altered how they were killed. From her curse mark of death, Ranni was the first of the demigods whose flesh perished, while the Prince of Death perished in soul alone. The ramifications of this event were immense. While Ranni's body died, her soul remained. She took the body of a doll, representative of the Snow Witch who had taught her in her childhood, but her mission wasn't complete. She still needed to slay her Two Fingers, and she began searching for the hidden treasure of Nokron that had been used in the past, the Fingerslayer Blade. Cannot be wielded by those without a fate, but is said to be able to harm the Greater Will and its vassals. Meanwhile, Godwyn's soul died, but not his body, which would have strange and far-reaching ramifications. His body continues on living, and slowly, his death rots into the roots of the Erdtree itself, spreading into the roots like a living disease. The rune of death spreads across the lands between, through the underground roots of the Great Tree, sprouting in the form of Deathroot. After the night of the plot, Deathroot appeared in the lands between, and those who live in death soon followed. Skeletal militiamen are spirits of militiamen who live in death and will continue to rise again until properly finished off. This is the grotesque fate of those who come into contact with Deathroot.
Those who live in death fall outside the principles of the Golden Order. Their mere existence sullies the guidance of gold, tainting its truth. And so it is the vermin must be exterminated, down to the very last.
Members of the Golden Order took it upon themselves to cleanse the land of those who live in death, viewing it as a stain on the Golden Order. As a result of the stolen fragment, Malekith seemed to be held responsible as its keeper. After a fragment of death was stolen on that fateful night, Malekith bound the blade within his own flesh, such that none might ever rob death again. It seems to me that Marika punished Malekith, forcing him to retrieve the death shards he had lost and giving him an insatiable hunger for it. Malekith went back to his roots as the Beastman Garank, hunting down and consuming death, ever trying to reseal it.
I'm not sated. Feed me more. Death.
While it's unclear this is exactly when, it seems like it was after Ranni killed Godwyn that Radahn would challenge the stars, perhaps to directly stop her fate and prevent her from getting what she wanted. The mightiest hero of the demigods confronted the falling stars alone, and thus did he crush them, his conquest sealing the very fate of the stars.
But General Radahn is the conqueror of the stars, who stood up to the swirling constellations, halting their movement in a smashing victory.
But long ago, General Radahn challenged the swirling constellations, and in a crushing victory arrested their cycles. Now he is the force that repulses the stars.
Radahn earned considerable renown as the Star Scourge in his youth, and it is said that it was during this time he engraved the gravity crest upon these blades. The reason I tie this event as being related to Ranni is because of the following line of dialogue from Blythe.
So Ranni's fate is kept in stasis by Starscourge Radahn.
Either before Radahn would challenge the stars, or sometimes after, it seems the death of Godwyn drove Marika to do the unthinkable.
Queen Marika was driven to the brink. The shattering ensued, a war that wrought only darkness. The Elden Ring was broken. But by whom? And why?
Queen Marika herself shattered the Elden Ring, while her other self, Radagon, tried to repair it. The hammer partially broke upon shattering the ring, becoming splintered with rune fragments. It's worth noting that Radagon actually opposed her.
O Radagon, leal hound of the Golden Order, thou art yet to become me. Thou art yet to become a god. Let us be shattered, both. Mine other self.
The Elden Beast reacted by sealing Marika inside the Erdtree, and seems to have also crucified her. Although, while I believe that the Elden Beast was involved in the sealing, it's also notable that Radagon's seal is on the Erdtree, preventing entry, so perhaps it was a mix of both.
Queen Marika is the vessel of the Elden Ring, carrier of its vision. A god in truth. But after the Elden Ring's shattering, she was imprisoned in the Erdtree, a grim punishment for shattering the Order, despite her godhood.
How and if they had to fight for it is unclear, but Marika's demigod children inherited shards of the Elden Ring: Morgott, Mohg, Radahn, Rykard, Malenia, and Miquella, as well as Godric, who could have been a grandson or even further down the Golden Lineage progeny. These shards making them even more powerful. Given the following dialogue Marika spoke to her children,
Hear me, demigods, my children beloved. Make of thyselves that which ye desire. Be it a lord, be it a god, but should ye fail to become aught at all, ye will be forsaken, amounting only to sacrifices.
It does make me wonder, also given the line that they inherited shards of the Elden Ring, if perhaps there was a small window before Marika was locked away for shattering the Elden Ring where she, herself, gave her children the shards. At the same time, Erdtree avatars appeared to protect the Erdtree's very own offspring, the minor Erdtrees. The avatars emerging in the wake of the Elden Ring's shattering were determined to protect the withering Erdtree's offspring. And in the vacuum of power, with Marika/Radagon sealed away, followed massive turmoil and a struggle for succession. It seems Morgott quickly became the main protector of Leyndell, Order, and the Erdtree.
Morgott the Grace-Given is Lord of Leyndell, the capital city.
Though born one of the Graceless Omen, Morgott took it upon himself to become the Erdtree's protector. He loved not in return, for he was never loved, but nevertheless, love it he did. That the Omen King was born of the Golden Lineage, and that he was indeed the Lord of Leyndell. At first, there was a sovereign alliance amongst the demigods, however, there was a conspiracy to take over. The ones behind this conspiracy were likely Godofroy and Godric. A massive war ensued at the gates of Leyndell, and Morgott and his forces held strong. This would become known as the First Defense of Leyndell. This is also when Godofroy, another member of the Golden Lineage, would be captured by the ancient Dragon Knight Kristoff. This event would earn Kristoff the hero's honor of Erdtree burial. It's also likely that this is when Godric the Grafted was hounded from Leyndell, the royal capital. It seems at this point, Radahn was on the side of Morgott, for Godric seemed to be fleeing from Radahn. Kenneth Haidt tells us of Godric that
first, he hid himself amongst the womenfolk to flee the capital, then hid from Radahn in that castle.
Godric fled to Stormveil Castle, where he set up a base and continued to graft himself in order to make himself more powerful, likely planning to try and return one day to Leyndell. Morgott would have to defend Leyndell a second time, and during the second defense of Leyndell, the Fell Omens stacked high the corpses of heroes. We also see from the intro cutscene that Morgott seems to have defeated Radahn in war, so this was likely what the second defense of Leyndell was about. Either way, the result was in Radahn setting up his base in Caelid. Around this time, at the Academy of Raya Lucaria, rather than taking advantage of the tumultuous events happening within the Golden Order, they chose to avoid conflict.
Only its doors have been closed for quite some time now. After they declared they wouldn't interfere with the Shattering, the Academy cast repelling seals on the east gate leading to the capital, and the south gate leading here. As you might have guessed, the seals are still active, making entry to the Academy impossible without a glintstone key.
I think it was also around this time, early into the Shattering, that Miquella lost faith in the Golden Order. Miquella seemed to be driven to cure his sister of her rot. We're told that he abandoned Golden Order fundamentalism, for it could do nothing to treat Malenia's accursed rot. This was the beginning of unalloyed gold. Miquella would leave Leyndell entirely and plant a brand new tree to counter the Erdtree, the Halig Tree. Here, he took on various beings who had been spurned by the Golden Order, such as the Albinaurics, creating a haven for them. Though watered with Miquella's own blood, since it was a sapling, the Halig Tree ultimately failed to grow into an Erdtree. While the Halig Tree failed, likely in Miquella's mission to become a god, Miquella's plotting and planning wasn't over. And so, Miquella made his heartfelt wish, that Radahn would one day be his king consort.
Lord brother. I'm going to be a god. If we honor our part of the vow, promise me you'll be my consort. I'll make the world a gentler place.
All of that said, we never hear Radahn's thoughts, and it's my suspicion that Radahn wasn't interested in being Miquella's consort. Radahn is known for his love of battle and war, and a gentler place and Miquella's planned Age of Compassion doesn't really fit in with who Radahn was. Another important note about Miquella is that he possesses the ability to manipulate others and make them lose their sense of self, and do things for him. He has the ability to steal hearts, which he can quite literally do when you battle him in the DLC.
Lord of the Old Order, let us go together.
Miquella the Kind is a monster, pure and radiant. He wields love to shrive clean the hearts of men. There is nothing more terrifying.
Even Malenia, whose blade never saw defeat, recognized just how fearsome Miquella truly was. My brother will keep his promise. He possesses the wisdom, the lure of a god. He is the most fearsome Empyrean of all. Moving back to the Wars of Leyndell, a third major war would take place, this time with Rykard. Rykard had already grown disillusioned with the Erdtree and Golden Order in general. In fact, he'd actually helped Ranni in her plot to kill Godwyn the Golden. After all, after the night she'd have Godwyn killed, she rewarded Praetor Rykard with the Blasphemous Claw. It's possible that all of his inquisitions and questioning of those who disagreed with the Golden Order and Erdtree had led to he himself questioning the Erdtree. When Rykard turned to heresy, taking by force became the rule. The gods themselves were no different, after all.
Our Lord, indignant, has refused to scurry about, fighting over what miserly scraps they allow us. If the Erdtree, and indeed the very gods, would debase us so, then we are willing to raise the banner of resistance, even if it means heresy.
So it's likely that it was he who burned the minor Erdtree near him, gaining the ire of Morgott and the Erdtree. So Morgott began a campaign to fight against Rykard, setting up camps along the way, with Leyndell's soldiers fighting against Rykard's. The consequences would be dire for both sides, and in particular for Leyndell.
The volcano, Mount Gelmir, lies in the west of the Altus Plateau, the realm of the Erdtree. It was the stage of the most appalling battle in the entirety of the Shattering. Rykard has committed the grave sin of blasphemy, marking himself as an enemy never to be forgiven.
As the battle waged on, it seems Leyndell's forces were primarily repelled. However, Rykard would do something so blasphemous, he'd draw the ire of his own forces and lose their support. Rykard would feed himself to a blasphemous serpent. Rykard took the form of a giant serpent that he might devour, grow, and live eternally. I understand. The road of blasphemy is long and perilous. One cannot walk it unprepared to sin.
Praetor Rykard's ambitions, though blasphemous, marked him a worthy sovereign, but they were reduced to gluttonous depravity once he gave himself to the serpent. Whatever that thing is, it is no longer Praetor Rykard. Someone must kill him to spare him and his ambitions from further dishonor.
Tanith was the only human to remain by his side when he became the Serpent of Blasphemy. The Gelmir Knight armor states that it bears an emblem that none wear any longer, standing as it does for a lord that fell from loft ambition into gluttonous depravity. As the lord lost his dignity, so too did these knights lose their master. So it seems he was abandoned by his men. Our next major event comes from Miquella and Malenia, who it seems were ready to act on Miquella's ambitions. Malenia would march south with her Cleanrot Knights in order to defeat Radahn. The reason seemed to be in order to force Radahn into becoming Miquella's consort. This also seems like the perfect time to do so, as if Radahn had been repelled from Leyndell and retreated to Caelid, his Redmane forces were likely wounded and recovering. So Malenia marched south and even encountered Godric, who somehow drew her ire, resulting in a battle.
Then he insulted Malenia, lost to her in battle, only to lick her boots rather than die like a man. Has he no shame? The big girl's blouse?
After defeating Godric, she'd continue marching eastward and into Caelid, where she'd encounter Radahn, resulting in yet another major battle between two opposing forces. Malenia and Radahn would end up directly facing off against one another.
conqueror of the stars, General Radahn. And the blade of Mikola and Melania the Seventh. These two were the mightiest to remain, and locked horns in combat. But there would be no victor.
While it seemed like Radahn was about to defeat Melania in battle, she whispered something to him. Mikola awaits the promised consort. And with that, she unleashed her Scarlet Aeonia, a move it seems that was meant to destroy Radahn, but also resulted in the absolute devastation of Caelid. Her rot spread throughout Caelid, destroying and cursing men and countryside alike.
And now Caelid has been engulfed by the Scarlet Rot. Even approaching the region is no mean feat. I've heard survivors of Radahn's army are still in the wilds, staving off the rot with fire. And if it's true, I suspect Radahn is still there as well, in Caelid. Though, I doubt he much resembles his former self anymore.
However, while Radahn was defeated, he didn't die. No, he'd end up wandering the land and seemingly growing more and more insane.
General Radahn is cursed ever to wander. Eaten from the inside by Melania's scarlet rot, his wits are long gone. Now he gathers the corpses of former friends and foes alike, gorging on them like a dog.
At the same time, while Melania had defeated the Redbane army, it seems bursting into Scarlet Aeonia, as well as the battle itself, had taken a toll on her. She immediately fell into a deep slumber, and it was the Cleanrot Knight Finlay, one of the few survivors of the Battle of Aeonia, who carried her all the way back from Caelid to the Erdtree. During this period of time, while Melania was off fighting and attempting to kill Radahn, another major part of Mikola's scheme was taking place back in the Erdtree. Mikola seduced Mohg into defiling his body in order to remove his grace and allow him access to the sealed-off Shadowlands. Mohg was tricked and charmed into thinking he would become Mikola's consort. Wishing to raise Mikola to full godhood, Mohg wished to become his consort, taking the role of monarch. But no matter how much of his bloody bedchamber he tried to share, he received no response from the young Empyrean. Mohg took Mikola underground to the Mohgwyn Palace, where he believed he and Mikola would be starting a new Mohgwyn dynasty. However, unbeknownst to him, Mikola planned to use Mohg's body as a vessel for Radahn's soul, who would be his true consort.
As if using Lord Mohg to gain entrance to the Land of Shadow were not enough, he plans to use his corpse as the vessel of his king consort. He has forsaken Lord Mohg's soul. He desires only his empty shell. It beggars belief, but I'm afraid tender Mikola fails to grasp the humiliation implied by this act.
And so, Melania returned to the Erdtree to rest, empty of Mikola. Mikola was left decrepit in Mohg's domain, where Mohg defiled him, allowing Mikola to enter the Land of Shadow. Radahn would wander Caelid, an insane husk of his former self. Ranni remained steady, building up followers and hunting for a Fingerslayer blade so she could free herself from the Greater Will. Rykard grew and devoured others as a blasphemous serpent. Morgott would defend Leyndell from all attempting to become Elden Lord. Godric would hide away in Stormveil Castle, grafting himself with others, seemingly to grow his strength. Godwyn's body would continue to rot and decay, infecting the roots of the Erdtree and slowly infecting the rest of the world from beneath. And America would remain crucified within the Erdtree, while Radagon attempted to mend the Elden Ring. And this seems to be the state of the world when the Tarnished would rise. We're told, as no demigods arose victorious, the Greater Will abandoned them. Although, it may be more accurate to say that America, instead, would look for a new lord to extend her reign. And thus, she would keep her promise, returning grace to the graceless Tarnished, which would bring them back to life.
Oh,
Rise now, ye tarnished, ye dead who yet live. The call of long-lost grace speaks to us all. Horalu, chieftain of the Badlands, the ever-brilliant Gold Mask. Fear, the deathbed companion, the loathsome Dung-Eater, and Sir Gideon Othmere, the all-knowing.
And one other, whom grace would again bless. A tarnished of no renown. Cross the fog to the lands between. To stand before the Elden Ring and become the Elden Lord.
And thus begins your story. Marika and her grace guides you. Will you become an Elden Lord and maintain the status quo? Will you take the route of the Dung-Eater and the Fell Curse and decide that if all is cursed and Omen, then no one is cursed? Will you take the route of Thea and the Death Prince and decide that a Golden Order with death restored to the world is the correct way? Or perhaps the route of Gold Mask and the Perfect Order and bring the world to an even deeper Golden Order fundamentalism? Will you challenge Miquella and prevent him from becoming a god and starting his Age of Compassion? After all, it was Miquella who was truly behind the decimation of Caelid and who seems to have abandoned Saint Trina, his moral side, in order to become a god. Miquella, who's shown he's not above charming and using others to obtain his means, even if it's not what they truly want. Will you join the side of Ranni, abandon the greater will in Erdtree, and bring about an Age of the Stars? Or will you join the frenzied flame and burn it all into chaotic nothingness? And that wraps up the Elden Ring timeline. I hope you enjoyed. I'm sure there are details you may disagree with, which is perfectly cool. My understanding of the lore and story are always evolving, and this is just my current understanding, which can change at any moment. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As I mentioned at the start of the video, there are many fantastic content creators in the Elden Ring space, and ones who focus specifically on story and lore. I'd love if you checked them out and gave them your support.
After all, everyone has a unique perspective and understanding to bring to the table, and this is a puzzle that we're all solving together. So, I'm Dave Klein, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.